Hi there, Alison here with another Cab Franc du jour. Today we are in Villány, Hungary, and we're looking at the Wassmann 2016 Villány Cabernet Franc. The Wassmann wine estate was established in 2002 by two Germans, Ralf Wassmann and Susann Hanauer. And the region of Villány actually has a long historical connection with Germany that dates back to the mid-18th century when a large wave of German settlers arrived to the region. And of course, with them, they brought grape varieties. The most important at the time would have been Portugieser. And this grape went on to become one of the most important historical varieties in Villány. Now, it's this curious combination of a German grape variety and a Hungarian wine growing region that brought Ralf and Susann to the region from the get-go. And when they got there, they arrived and they discovered this wonderful connection between Germany and Villány, and they felt quite at home here. And as a result, they decided to establish their vineyards and winery here. Now, as wine professionals and wine students, the only thing we really tend to learn about when it comes to Hungarian wine is, of course, Tokaji. So where are we here in relation to Tokaji? We're in fact really far away. We are in the deep southern part of Hungary here. We are about 345 kilometers, it's 215 miles southwest of Tokaji. We're about 10 kilometers north of the Drava River, which marks the border of southern Hungary and Croatia. The region of Villány stretches about 25 kilometers along the southern slopes of the Villány Hills, and there's about 2,400 hectares under vine. The climate is considered continental with Mediterranean influences, and the region also receives the highest number of sunshine hours of any growing region in Hungary, about 2,100 in total. And it's this combination of long sunshine hours and a long moderate growing season that makes Villány the premier red wine growing region in Hungary. Now, in terms of the soils here, the bedrock is layers of limestone and dolomite that date to the Triassic, Jurassic, and Cretaceous periods in history. And the topsoils here are a combination of clay and loess. And loess is light, dusty, like wind-derived sediments. And the sort of proportion of clay and loess varies depending on the site. The depth also varies, anywhere from 2 meters upwards to 20 meters, depending on where you are in Villány and where you are in terms of where your vines are planted on the slope. So where does Cabernet Franc fit into this whole picture? Well, in fact, Cabernet Franc has a long historical presence in the region. So the region of Villány was home to Zsigmond Teleki, who's a very important historical figure in the world of wine. He was a rootstock breeder, and he was the one that developed the Berlandieri Riparia rootstock. And this today, of course, is a very important rootstock as it relates to the grafting of vinifera vines. This rootstock is ideally suited to more vigorous soils and also more calcareous soils, an example of which would be SO4. So back to Teleki, post-Phylloxera, Teleki establishes an experimental vineyard which he uses to test the grafting of vinifera vines onto his rootstocks. So of course, as a scientist, he decides to not only plant native Hungarian varieties, but also international varieties as well, like Cabernet Franc. So here we are at the end of the 19th century, post-Phylloxera, and Cabernet Franc is in the ground in Villány. And as a result of Teleki's work, Villány was actually the first region in Hungary to be replanted to vines post-Phylloxera. And over the course of time, Cabernet Franc has adapted really beautifully to the conditions here in Villány. And today, the variety represents 15% of all vines planted. Now, the region of Villány is really hanging its hat on Cabernet Franc as a flagship grape variety. So much so that they've actually developed a special appellation of origin for Cabernet Franc called Villány Franc. This appellation of origin was set up in 2014, and it's for 100% Cabernet Franc based wines from the region. It has specific yield requirements, a maximum of 35 hectoliters per hectare. And in terms of aging requirements, it has specific aging requirements as well for both in barrel as well as bottle before release. So for this wine today, this is coming from a 0.4 hectare parcel of Cabernet Franc vines that was planted in 2007. And in terms of where we are in a single vineyard site called Hidikut, and we're in the village of Siklos, which is in the sort of the western part of Villány. And it is a little bit of a cooler microclimate here. The vines are planted towards the top of the slope at about 225 meters or so above sea level, and we are on that all-important limestone bedrock here as well. Now, from a winemaking perspective, this wine, or the grapes I should say, were harvested by hand. The fruit was destemmed. Fermentation was done in open-top wooden fermenters with indigenous yeast. They did some active pumped overs during the active fermentation phase, and then it stayed on skins for about 30 days. Aging was then done in a combination of Hungarian and French oak for about 20 months before bottling. And I should also say as well that the Wassmann winery was the first winery in Villány to receive organic certification, which they got in 2003. And they also received their Demeter certification for biodynamic viticulture and winemaking in 2011. So let's get into the wine. Now the nose has this really alluring perfume. There's some definite sweet fruits that I'm getting on the nose, like sort of dark cherry, a little bit of black currant here. There's a bit of kirsch as well. And then there's beautiful floral perfume, which comes through for me as like lavender. And the pyrazines are kind of on equal footing with the fruit profile. I'm getting some notes of like tarragon here, a little bit of cured tobacco. There's a little touch of like a capsicum thing going on. But it does have this sort of a sweet sort of fruit profile and also a certain degree of savoriness to the nose as well. There's also a spiciness on the nose, which is quite nice. And normally I get spice on the palate with Cab Franc, but there's a certain degree of spiciness on the nose as well. Now, all those same fruits come through really nicely on the palate, and that spice note comes through quite pronounced with this lovely sort of nutmeg, an allspice note, and there's even a little bit of like a licorice cocoa thing going on the palate as well. The acidity is really mouth-watering, quite fresh, and the way that sort of black currant kind of punches in there with the acidity is quite lovely as well. Now, in terms of the tannins, these are definitely firmer tannins, on a little bit more on the riper side, and there is a distinctive kind of chew to the tannins. They almost have a texture that's reminiscent to me of corduroy, if that makes sense to anybody. But they do sort of hug the tongue, they sit broadly on the palate, but there is a certain degree of backbone here in terms of how the acidity kind of cinches everything in terms of the palate. Yeah, there's really interesting sort of savoriness to the fruit profile, and in terms of the mouthfeel, it is medium bodied, and there is a certain degree of sort of spiciness. There's density here, there's a fleshiness, there's almost like a meatiness to this wine, which is really interesting. And it does sort of like kind of suggests that it is coming from a slightly warmer microclimate because of how sort of fleshy and sort of dense it has that sort of feeling in terms of the palate. But at the same time, there is a certain degree of finesse and elegance here. The way the perfume hits, the way the acid sort of creates a sense of levity, and the way that these two sort of polarizing kind of things are happening on the palate makes for a really quite compelling wine. You know, this wine is really, it's stripped down, feels really honest. There's a lot of layers here. There's a lot going on. But it feels really true to the grape. It feels really true to the people. And it also feels really true to the place, in my opinion. And it's a really great introduction to Cabernet Franc from Hungary. If you've had an example of Cabernet Franc from Hungary, please let me know what you thought of it, of course, in the comments below. And of course, as always, I will be back again soon with another wine. Cheers.